The girl they gave away. In the small village of Kasinga, where dusty roads curled between tired houses and gossip traveled faster than rain clouds, there lived a girl named Esther, who learned very early that not every home was a place of safety. Some homes were storms with roofs. Some families fed you food while starving your spirit. By the age of 15, Esther already understood the sound of hatred hidden inside ordinary things. She heard it in the scrape of her stepmother's voice each morning before sunrise, in the sharp way plates were dropped before her at dinner, in the laughter of her stepbrothers when they watched her carry heavy buckets while they sat beneath the mango tree doing nothing. Her father had once been gentle, before grief hollowed him out. After Esther's mother died, giving birth to a child who did not survive either, something inside him folded inward like burnt paper. A year later, he married Beatrice, a widow from the neighboring district with 3 children and eyes that always looked calculating, even when she smiled. At first, Beatrice pretended kindness, but cruelty is like rot beneath paint. Eventually, it always shows through. Esther became a servant in the very house where she had once been cherished. While Beatrice's children wore polished shoes to school each morning, Esther stayed behind, washing clothes until her fingers wrinkled white in cold water. She swept floors, cooked meals, dug in the garden beneath the punishing sun, and slept on a thin mat near the kitchen like an afterthought nobody wanted to remember. The worst part was not even the labor, but the loneliness of watching her father slowly become blind to her suffering. Whenever she tried to speak, Beatrice twisted the story before it reached him. "She is lazy," she would sigh dramatically. "She talks back. She refuses to help me." And her father, exhausted from work and eager to avoid conflict, accepted those lies, because believing them was easier than facing the truth that he had failed his own daughter. Esther would lie awake at night, listening to rats scratch in the ceiling, while tears slid silently into her ears, wondering how a person could feel so invisible inside their own home. Yet despite everything, Esther loved learning with the desperate hunger of someone reaching toward light from the bottom of a deep well. She had attended school before Beatrice came into their lives, and though her education was interrupted more and more each year, she clung to books whenever she could. Sometimes she borrowed old textbooks from neighbors and read them by candlelight after everyone slept, tracing words carefully with tired fingers, as though knowledge itself might one day become a doorway out of her misery. But Beatrice hated seeing her read. "What use is education for a girl like you?" she sneered one evening, snatching a notebook from Esther's hands and throwing it into the cooking fire. "No man marries a woman because she can read big English words." Esther watched the pages curl into black ash, while something inside her quietly broke. Not long after Esther turned 16, whispers began moving through the village about a man named Gideon Muwanga. His name carried the kind of reputation mothers use to frighten children into obedience. People claimed he was cold-hearted, dangerous, ruthless in business dealings, and impossible to approach. Some said he once beat a man nearly to death for stealing from him. Others claimed women feared him because he never smiled and lived alone in a large house near the edge of town where nobody visited unless necessary. The stories grew larger each time they were told, until Gideon became less a man and more a shadow people feared without understanding. Beatrice listened to those stories with narrowed eyes and growing interest. One night, Esther overheard them talking in the sitting room. Beatrice's voice was low and eager, while her father sounded hesitant. "She is a burden," Beatrice insisted. "Another mouth to feed. Gideon is willing to pay generously. Do you think opportunities like this come often?" Esther froze outside the doorway, her heartbeat turning loud and sick inside her chest. "But she is still young," her father murmured weakly. "Young girls become wives every day," Beatrice snapped. "At least this way she will finally be useful." Esther felt the ground tilt beneath her feet as realizations spread through her like poison. They were selling her. Not marrying her lovingly into a family, selling her like livestock to a man feared by the entire village. The days before the arrangement felt unreal, like living inside a nightmare that moved too slowly to escape. Esther begged her father with tears streaming down her face, but he would not meet her eyes. Shame clung to him heavily, yet not heavily enough to stop what was happening. Beatrice, meanwhile, seemed almost joyful, already spending part of the money Gideon had given in advance. On the morning Esther was sent away, nobody embraced her. Nobody cried. Beatrice only shoved a small bag of clothes into her hands and hissed, "Do not embarrass us there." Her stepbrothers laughed as she climbed into the waiting vehicle, and her father remained standing in the doorway looking smaller than she had ever seen him. Esther stared at the house until it disappeared behind dust, feeling as though she were being carried toward the end of her life. The journey to Gideon's estate was long and silent, except for the hum of the tires against the road. Esther sat rigidly with fear, imagining every terrible story she had heard about him. By the time they arrived, her entire body trembled. The house itself stood large and isolated among tall trees, not extravagant but solid and strangely quiet. A servant led her inside, and moments later Gideon entered the room. Esther nearly stopped breathing. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a stern face marked by old scars and eyes so unreadable they frightened her instantly. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking in a calm voice much gentler than she expected. "You must be tired from the journey. Food has been prepared." Esther blinked in confusion. That was all. No cruelty, no roughness, just simple concern. The first weeks left Esther constantly confused because nothing about Gideon matched the monster villagers described. He never raised his voice at her, never touched her improperly, never demanded she behave like a wife. Instead, he gave her a comfortable room, hired tutors to help her catch up academically, and told the household staff to treat her respectfully. Esther waited each day for the hidden cruelty to reveal itself. Certain kindness this strange had to be temporary, but it never came. One evening during dinner, she finally gathered enough courage to ask, "Why do people say such terrible things about you?" Gideon leaned back quietly before answering with a faint, tired smile. "Because when people fear you, they leave you alone. I learned long ago that peace is easier when nobody wants to come close." Slowly, Esther began telling him pieces of her life, first cautiously, then more openly as trust grew between them. She spoke about her mother dying, about Beatrice's cruelty, about the education stolen from her, about nights crying silently because nobody seemed to care whether she existed. Gideon listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with every detail. When she finished one evening, embarrassed by how much she had revealed, he simply said, "What happened to you was wrong." Esther nearly cried at those words because nobody had ever said them before. Not once. All her suffering had always been treated like something she deserved or something too unimportant to notice. Hearing another human acknowledge her pain felt like warm sunlight reaching frozen skin. Months turned into years, and the frightened girl who arrived at Gideon's home slowly transformed into someone stronger. He enrolled her back in school officially, despite villagers gossiping viciously about their arrangement. He ignored every insult thrown his way. Esther flourished academically, astonishing teachers with her intelligence and determination. For the first time in her life, she had space to dream beyond survival. She laughed more, smiled more. She no longer walked with shoulders bent under invisible weight. And through it all, Gideon remained steady beside her, never pressurizing her, never treating her like property despite the agreement made with her family. On her 18th birthday, he sat with her beneath the veranda, while rain whispered softly across the roof, and said quietly, "You owe me nothing, Esther. When your studies are complete, you may leave if that is what you want. If you wish to stay, then stay because it is your choice, not because anyone sold you to me." Those words settled deeply into Esther's heart, because real love had never been offered to her before without conditions attached. She began seeing Gideon not through the fearful lens of village gossip, but through the countless quiet acts revealing his true nature. The way he ensured servants' children attended school. The way he secretly paid medical bills for struggling families while pretending indifference publicly. The way he always listened carefully when she spoke, as though her thoughts mattered. Esther realized the world had mistaken silence for cruelty because people often fear what they do not understand. By the time Esther graduated from university years later, she stood before the audience transformed into a woman nobody from Kasinga would have recognized. elegant, educated, confident. As she walked across the stage receiving honors, her eyes searched the crowd until they found Gideon sitting quietly in the back row, pride shining openly in his usually guarded expression. Later that evening, after celebrations ended and stars spread across the night sky like scattered diamonds, Esther found him alone outside. Her heart beat wildly as she approached. "You once told me I could choose freely," she whispered. Gideon nodded slowly. "Yes." Esther smiled softly through tears gathering in her eyes. "Then I choose you." For the first time since she had known him, Gideon looked completely undone by emotion. Years of restraint cracked open in his expression as he cupped her face gently, almost disbelievingly. Their kiss carried not only love but healing, the closing of wounds both visible and hidden. Esther gave herself to him that night not out of obligation, fear, or pressure, but from genuine love freely chosen, and the tenderness with which Gideon held her afterward made her mourn all over again for the girl who once believed she deserved nothing good. Their marriage became the kind people rarely believe exists outside stories. Not perfect because no life truly is, but deeply rooted in mutual respect and devotion. They built a home filled with warmth Esther had once thought impossible. Laughter replaced fear, peace replaced loneliness. Soon children followed, beautiful little souls who climbed onto Gideon fearlessly, despite his intimidating appearance, because to them he was simply Baba, the man whose large hands always felt safe. Esther often watched him playing with their children and thought about how close she came to never knowing happiness at all. Meanwhile, back in Kasinga, Beatrice's greed eventually consumed everything. The money received from Esther's marriage vanished quickly through reckless spending and poor decisions. Her stepbrothers grew lazy and irresponsible. Debts mounted. The family's small comforts disappeared one by one until even the house itself was threatened. People who once admired Beatrice now avoided her. Pride collapsed into desperation. Eventually, with nowhere else to turn, Beatrice gathered her children and traveled to Gideon's estate, hoping Esther's success might rescue them from ruin. When they arrived, Esther felt old pain stirring at the sight of them standing there, worn and humbled by hardship. Beatrice immediately began crying dramatically, speaking about family, forgiveness, and second chances. But before Esther could answer, Gideon stepped forward calmly. His presence alone silenced them. He looked at Beatrice with cold understanding and said quietly, "When she needed kindness, you gave her suffering. When she needed protection, you sold her. You do not get to return now simply because life became difficult." Beatrice tried protesting, but Gideon's voice hardened. "Leave this place. My wife owes you nothing." Esther stood silently beside him, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that someone had finally defended her. As the gates closed behind her stepfamily, Esther felt something ancient loosen inside her chest, like chains rusting apart after years in darkness. She looked up at Gideon, the man the world called a monster, and saw instead the person who had rescued her without ever trying to own her. The frightened girl sold away before adulthood had become a woman loved deeply and freely. And in the quiet, golden light of evening, surrounded by the family they built together, Esther understood at last that sometimes salvation arrives wearing the face everyone else fears, and sometimes the cruelest people smile sweetly while destroying lives behind closed doors.